Thank you very much. Is my microphone working? I have a very soft voice, so if I don't have a microphone, you probably won't hear me. It's really a great honor to be suggested as one of the presenters for this last lecture series. We've had some really outstanding people present, from Bob Miniger to Maniger to Stacy, as well as many other people. I've heard several of them, and they've all been very good, and that makes me very nervous. There's in psychology, we have a principle called the approach avoidance conflict, and you all know how this works, I'm sure. You know, it's an idea, a goal sounds, you have a goal, and it has approach tendencies and avoidance tendencies. And when you're a distance away from the goal, the approach tendency is very strong. But as you move toward the goal, getting closer, then the avoidance tendency takes over. Well, that was my situation. It sounded like a great idea, distance away, and getting closer, the avoidance tendency began to take over. It's kind of like, you have heard that question asked, would you rather deliver the eulogy or be in the casket? And most people would rather be in the casket, and sometimes right now, I feel maybe that's... So anyway, this is a very awesome, I really feel overawed with this particular situation. But my thinking as I approach this, the last thing I want to talk about is myself. So I struggled with the idea, what would one say in giving the last lecture? One needs to talk about something that one knows something about. Well, what do I know about that I could meld together to create a last lecture? And I guess the thing I know best is myself. Plato told us to know thyself. So maybe the last thing I need to talk about is myself. So anyway, that is where I'm starting. So you could call this kind of a reminiscence. Some lessons I've learned along the way. I think there are about a dozen books with that title. I'm going to relate a few memories and then talk about them and then close with a poem. And I think one other thing that we should keep in mind is that one's last lecture shouldn't be too long. So, the beginning. It was a cold... And it really was. It was a cold and rainy night in February in a small town in North Alabama, Rogersville. That's what Rogersville looked like. Probably still looks that way. My mother was at my grandmother's house and was about to give birth. The doctor, Dr. McKee, had been sent for, but he had not arrived. My grandmother was a practical nurse, and so things were going to be okay. But we were hoping, I didn't have any conscience, but they were hoping that the doctor would arrive, and he did in the nick of time. In delivering me, he noted that this sure was a small baby. They didn't have scales, so they didn't weigh me, but I was evidently little. Maybe the doctor said less than 5 pounds, but I did seem to be healthy. And so here we are. You will notice something about my skills in technology here. The light, of course, emanates from me. You'll notice how bright I am, but really it emanates from the flash bulb as I tried to take these pictures. But there is what I look like at 6 months, and there's my mom and dad and me as a very young kid. To illustrate how small I was, not long after my birth, my mom was going to visit my dad. He worked for TVA, and he was up and down the Tennessee River from Knoxville to Paducah, Kentucky, quite often. He was in, I think, Rock Island, Tennessee. And so she was at the bus station, and she was going to visit my dad, and she was holding me, and a lady walked up to her. And she said, "Ma'am, if you don't get that baby to a doctor right away, he's going to die." and I didn't. I'm still here, but it does illustrate how small I must have looked from the beginning. So one of the lessons from life is even if you begin small, you can get bigger. And I have gotten bigger, not huge, but I worry about that. But growing up, I grew up in North Alabama. You can see here's the state of Alabama. Those two northwest corner counties, Lauderdale and Colbert, are the counties that I spent most of my life in. You probably remember Colbert County. Stephen Colbert spent a number of shows earlier on telling people that they named Colbert County for Stephen Colbert. They just mispronounced it. But anyway, that is where Sheffield is located. Florence is the largest town in this area, and it's in Lauderdale County. Some of you may have heard of Florence, but maybe not Sheffield, Tuscumbia, and Muscle Shoals. But those are the cities that are in this particular area, and I'll mention them a couple of times as we talk about them. One of the big sites that you can see in this part of the world, the Tennessee River flows right between Lauderdale and Colbert County, and there's the Tennessee River you can see, and that's Wilson Dam. And Wilson Dam is a magnificent structure, beautiful dam. You can see the shoals, the rocks. This was a really rocky area at one point. The Army Corps of Engineers built this dam in the early part of the 20th century, actually during World War I, because they had built two nitrate plants in the area, and they needed electricity to fund those, or to run those nitrate plants. They were using those nitrate plants for ammunition for World War I. And so this is one of our sites that you can see. Before this dam was built, this was the Shoals area, Muscle Shoals it was called. And it was one of the largest, probably most beautiful shoals areas in the world. Water running over rocks, beautiful. You've seen shoals before. And the dam covered most of that up, but it made this area, you could navigate now from above Knoxville, Tennessee, all the way to Paducah, Kentucky. The dam allowed that to occur. Now, the name of Muscle Shoals is interesting. One idea, it's lost to history, but one idea is that it took so much muscle to get across the shoals that they called it Muscle Shoals. But the other idea is that it was really muscle shoals. There are a lot of mussels in and around this area, but we Southerners simply spelled it wrong, which would be appropriate perhaps. But after World War I was over, and this huge, wonderful hydroelectric plant was there, Henry Ford thought this would be a great place to build some of his things, to build Fords and whatever. And so he worked with Congress, tried to develop a relation. He wanted to lease the dam for a number of years. And so he talked with Congress, he made propositions, and you know how Congress works with great speed. And they didn't work so speedily for him. This was in the 20s. But with Henry Ford down here, this became a real boom town. People from all over came down and began to think about this as the next Detroit. The streets were graded, the curbs were poured, sidewalks were poured. A lot of things were developed. It was really a boom town. The streets were Highland Park and Michigan Avenue and Woodward Avenue and Ford Avenue and Grand Avenue. All these streets were mapped out and graded and curbed. But then Henry Ford decided, well, I'm not going to do this. And he went back to Detroit. Now, what happened over time was that this area grew up, trees, bushes, briars, all of that sort of stuff. And when I was living there, when I was a young kid, we could walk in the woods, and there were a lot of woods in and around the area, and we would walk through the woods, and all of a sudden we would be on a sidewalk, and then occasionally we would come upon a street lamp just out there in the woods because it was deserted. But the idea of a boomtown, and people bought property from all over, you know, like some of the other boomtowns we've had. And so, but when Henry Ford left, these parcels of land weren't worth too much, and these people weren't able to sell them. So when you were buying property, even in I don't know, today it's different, but it was very difficult to get a clear deed because so many people had died who owned the land, and you had to get a clear title from, 25 grandchildren or something. So it was a difficult place to develop, but eventually it did. So one of the lessons from life is to be somewhat cautious in your business dealings. Perhaps this is why I'm a little more conservative than usual, a little more conservative than my wife, but we'll talk about that. Muscle Shoals developed really quite a lot in the past few years. This is an area of Alabama where there is a lot of musical talent, a lot of people who are interested in music. There's an Alabama Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Tuscumbia, and the Muscle Shoals sound, everybody from the Rolling Stones to Elton John, people from all over the world have come there to record. They have a great recording area, and they have done a lot over the past years. It's been written up in a number of magazines and some of the Eastern newspapers about this. Well, of course, you know, Elvis Presley was born, grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi, which is just across the line in Mississippi. So it's an area of a lot of talented musical people. But anyway, this is part of what Muscle Shoals is all about today. And we could talk about some of the other, Percy Sledge, you know him. But there are a lot of musicians from that area. You probably don't know Percy Sledge. He's a little bit. We do. So anyway, that is that's a claim to fame. Another claim to fame for this area is Helen Keller. Helen Keller was born in Tuscumbia, Alabama, and that's her home, which is a museum today, Ivy Green. And I used Norman Forsythe, who was my best friend in high school. We used to play in a tennis court across the street from Ivy Green. And once I heard Helen Keller speak at her home. She was visiting, and we heard her speak. It's very difficult to understand her, but she had an interpreter with her, and she is quite a remarkable lady and teaches us that there are few difficulties you can't overcome. And how do you like that tortured sentence? But anyway, as I was growing up, though, in Muscle Shoals, we spent most of our time outside. We played baseball, we played basketball, we played football. There were a lot of kids, and I grew up in Grand Avenue, and there were a lot of kids in the area, and we spent most of our time outside. We played corkball, and if any of you know how to play corkball, if you don't, I can tell you later on. But we did, we sometimes didn't have enough people to play a whole 9 people on a side, so we would divide the field down the middle and, play with fewer players. But we had a great time riding our bicycles up and down Grand Avenue. But one of the lessons I think that I learned early on was to be active. It was important to stay outdoors and to be active and to enjoy the outside. And we had a lot of friends. It was a wonderful time. But one of the most important things, and it's very appropriate that we talk about some of these things, I think, here in February, which is Black History Month. But as I grew up in Alabama, I was there was a darker side that I was pretty much unaware of. I knew that there were black communities and white communities. I went to Sheffield High School, and it was a white school. Even the building was painted white, and it was very much a white community. In Sheffield, there was another area across the tracks, literally, and it was called Baptist Bottom, and this is where most of the African American population lived, and they had their own high school called Sterling High School. And as you know, this was separate but equal. You can talk about that sometime. It wasn't equal, but segregation was a very big part of the world I grew up in. And I didn't know what I was in. I was very naive, so you can be naive and not realize it. And I think that was very much the situation that I was in. But it was a good childhood. I thank God for my mom and dad, God rest their souls. But they were very kind. You know, the N word you often heard as I was growing up. Not in my house. And if I had said something like that, my mom would have washed my mouth out with soap, which she did once. Not because I said that word, but because I said another word. But, I mean, she was very aware. She was very much concerned that we use appropriate language, particularly in that regard. So I'm very thankful for the life I had as a young child growing up in Muscle Shoals, even with this darker side. But then I went to college. I went to Anderson College. It was called then Anderson University today. And this was a big part of what you could say my awakening experience. This was a great school. I was excited to be there, to be a college student, to get accepted to a college. All of those kinds of things were so wonderful back then. And I lived in South House. That was a house near campus that had been renovated as a dormitory. And it was fine. I mean, it was an old house, but it was fine. There was only one shower, and that was in the basement. And there was a toilet in the basement, and on the first floor, and on the second floor. And you had to be careful taking a shower, because if one of those toilets was flushed, suddenly the temperature in the shower would change rather radically. So that was one of the, we had a guy, and I wish I could remember his name. I looked some things up in my annuals, but I didn't find his name. But there was a guy that sang. He was a black fella, and he sang in the shower, and his voice would resonate throughout all of South House, and he sounded just like Johnny Mathis. So that was a nice experience. But I had a good friend. I had a lot of friends there, but one guy that I became very good friends with, Bobby Thomas. Bobby, in fact, he and I got married, not to one another, but about the same time. And his wife and him and me and Betty, we often had meals together. He was a very good friend, and I did find a picture, not a very good one, of Bobby Thomas, but you can see him there. I'm going to tell you one story related to my experience with him, maybe two. But Bobby and I sold Cutco cutlery, the Cadillac of cutlery. Do any of you have Cutco? Great. You know, it's guaranteed for life. And if you break it, you send it to them, they'll send you a new one. If it gets dull, you send it to them, they'll sharpen it and send it back to you. I still have my set, and it's been sharpened several times. I have it in the car if any of you would like to purchase it. Now, Bobby and I tried to sell Cutco in order to make money. We were in college and we needed money, of course. And he was a much better salesman than I was. But nevertheless, we worked at this. But our manager had, he wanted to inspire us, and he found there was a Cutco sales convention in Pewaukee, Wisconsin, and he said we needed to go up there and get inspired, and we did. He had a Volkswagen bus. You know, they're coming back now. They're rebuilding them. But you know what they used to look like. And we had it packed full of people. And really, the fact that I'm here today is a miracle, because the guy who drove the bus had the attitude, had the idea, I don't know where he got it, but if you rode right on the bumper of an 18-wheeler, you could save gas. And so, but we made it up there and back. It was really quite a trip. But the thing that really played a role in moving me from my naivete was we stopped on the outskirts of Chicago, Max Galke, maybe that was our manager's name, and he pulled in and he, at a restaurant. And so we all piled out of the bus, 25 of us. There wasn't that many, but I mean a lot of us. And everybody moved toward the door. But Bobby was the only black fellow in the group. And I looked around and he wasn't moving in that direction. And I said, "Bobby, aren't you hungry?" And he said, "I don't want to cause any trouble." And it hit me upside the head like a board. I mean, here I travel throughout I mean, I'm not a widely traveled guy, but I traveled, and I never thought about stopping at a restaurant, a cafe, anywhere in the United States and going in to eat. And here he had this notion that if he were to go into this restaurant, it could cause some difficulty. And that really I took it for granted that everybody could eat at anywhere, but he didn't see it that way. So the world is often different when seen through other people's eyes, and Bobby was teaching me that. I also read a book about this time, Black Like Me. If any of you have not read it, that would be a good book, particularly in this month to read. It's about a fellow who used walnut stain and darkened his skin so that he would look like a black person, and shaved his head, and traveled throughout Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and the kind of experiences that he had had. And of course, writing as a white person, he could see the kind of negative experience that black people had that he had not had. So it's a very good book. I think he published it in '61, and I always think of that as being, well, that was yesterday, but I know most of you weren't born. But that's a good book to read. But another story, though, from this era. One evening, we were sitting around at South House, and as I told you, I think, we had, it was a diverse group that lived in South House, and we all talked a lot, had all kinds of discussions, about important issues like the mind-body problem and things of that nature, religious notions. Anderson was a religious-oriented school, so we argued a lot about that. But anyway, we were sitting around, and someone noted that the Pink Pony, which was a restaurant not far from campus, didn't serve people of color. They had one of those terrible signs. I haven't seen one in a while. Notice, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. And this is what they had, and they refused service to persons of color. So someone said, we ought to do something about this. This was during the time when sit-in demonstrations and such were taking place. And so, the die was cast. The idea was put forward. So we piled in 2 cars and went to the Pink Pony. And we went in, sat down, and there were, we filled up about 3 tables. And the waitress came over and said, I'm sorry, but you guys are going to have to leave. We don't serve people of color. This is whites only restaurant. And we said, no, we're not leaving until we're served. And she fumed a bit, stalked off, and another waitress came over. And she said similar sorts of things. And the second one said, I'm going to go get the manager. And the manager came out. And he said, you guys are causing trouble. Will you please leave? And he said, I'm going to go call the police. And he actually did. Now, this would be a really good story if I could say a SWAT team invaded the joint, beat us all up, took us off to Anderson jail, put us in a dungeon, and it didn't happen that way. Actually, the police officer evidently told the manager, I'm not going to get involved in this. It's not my business. And so the manager finally had a great idea. He said, aren't you all Anderson College students? And we said, yes. And he said, okay, I'm going to call your president. That'll fix you. So they called the president. Robert Reardon was our president at Anderson. And the manager said, you have a bunch of students out here, a bunch of boys, I think he called us, and they're causing trouble. And Dr. Reardon said, well, what are they doing? And he said, they're having some sort of sit-in demonstration. And Dr. Reardon said, I stand 100% behind them. And I've got to give him, he's a great guy. But the manager evidently came to his senses. And so he said, he thought perhaps, maybe, it would be a good idea if I serve these people. After all, they're going to pay me. And they're college students, and this restaurant is near the college campus. They might come over here and eat occasionally. That would be to my benefit. So he served us, took his sign down, and that was the end of that story. So, but that gives us a lesson that's important to take a stand. It's good to have a good group of guys that support you in taking a stand like that. I went to, from Anderson, my graduate work was done at the University of Georgia, and I could tell you several stories about Father John Mulroy, but I don't think I'll get into them. He integrated, before I got to Georgia, he integrated the Catholic school there in Georgia, and it caused a big stink. The Ku Klux Klan moved into Athens, and it was a fierce time. It ended up, Lineal Penn was killed. And as I said, these were all before I went to the University of Georgia. It was integrated by the time I was there, and all the schools in Athens were integrated. But largely with the effort of Father Mulroy, I actually, can you believe this? I taught 8th grade mathematics in a school that Father Mulroy had developed for persons to move toward the GED, particularly older persons who hadn't graduated from high school. So he was really a great person, and I said there's a lesson there. Don't let other people intimidate you. And he certainly didn't let the Ku Klux Klan intimidate him. He did what he thought was right. But then the major portion of my life has been here at Sam Houston, as somebody said, 48 years. That's a pretty long time. And I'm only 49. But I came to Sam Houston, and this has been a wonderful experience for me. Sam Houston is absolutely the greatest school in the world, I think. And it has provided us with a living for a number of years. We have won the award about a good place to work over and over again by the, the Chronicle of Higher Education. But it's wonderful. It's a great place. And we've got such, in the psychology department and education department, we really were one and the same. When just before I came, it was the Department of Psychology and Education. But Dr. Staggs, in his wisdom, created the psychology department. The inaugural year of the psychology department was 1970 when I came. Dr. Staggs had hired, I think, about 4 of us. John Simons, Lois Peast, me, and there was one other person. We were new hires, just out of grad, it's wonderful, wonderful time. And Dr. Staggs wanted to make sure that we were taken care of. When we came, he had rented an apartment for Betty and I. There was Betty and me, and we had Greg, who was about 6, almost 6, and Scott, who was not quite a year. But he rented us an apartment, paid the deposit, paid the first month's rent, to make sure that we had a place to live when we got here. Here's how the place looked when I came. Dr. Staggs, there's a picture of him and his bow tie. Dr. Staggs passed from us not long ago, this past fall. Actually, his funeral, the service was this year, but he died during December, I think. But he was a wonderful person, and he, as I said, established the psychology department. And we were just a small little group. There were about 8 of us at the beginning, many of those having dual appointments with education. Betty, my wife, got a job at Huntsville National Bank, which has long since gone, but and she borrowed money for us to pay back Dr. Staggs for what he had done for us. But Dr. Staggs is a fabulous person. You can't say enough about him and how much he has contributed to this university, but particular to the College of Education. Your counseling center is even named in part in his honor. So it was really great. I spent a long time, as I've said. The Department of Psychology was on the 3rd floor of the administration building. That's where we started. And as I said, 48 years. And oftentimes I think about all of this, and I think, what did I do to deserve this? My life has been so good. I just wonder what I did in a previous lifetime to deserve this kind of benefit. But now, my wife, one of the high points in my life was the Wall of Honor that my face was placed on so they could throw darts in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. That was really great. And this is my family, pretty much. You notice who is in the center and in bright colors. That's my wife, Betty. Now, Betty, we had this nice apartment, and it was great. I thought we'd live there the rest of our lives. But not Betty. Betty's not one to appreciate the status quo. And so she started looking for a house. And you can see my beautiful ability to copy photographs. But this was the house she found on Eucalyptus Street. It's just, where Calvary Baptist Church is? It's just down the road from that. And this was a house. It cost us $16,000. And I knew that this probably would be bankruptcy because that's more money than I made all the time in graduate school. But we bought it, and it felt good. I was a homeowner now. But then Betty, again, not satisfied, found a house in Forest Hills, which was the big neighborhood at that point in time, on Willow Bend. And you can see, again, my photography skills. And so she bought that, and it cost $34,000. And that, how many years will it take me to... And we hadn't sold Eucalyptus yet. By the way, Eucalyptus, the house we lived in there, Bruce Fullenwider, I don't know if any of you know him. He was in charge of grounds here at Sam Houston for a number of years. He's the one really that made a lasting contribution to the beauty of Sam Houston campus. Something is blooming all the time. That was one of his mottos. So, but anyway, he still lives there, by the way. And we moved to Forest Hills. And that was great. But I thought we weren't going to make it. I mean, I'm conservative. Betty, not so much. She got her real estate license, and so we several houses. She has built from scratch at least 3 houses, and she has finished off a number of others. This was the first house she built, which is on Timberwood Drive, and I thought that was the final resting place. But then, of course, several houses. We lived in, let's see, how many houses? We had 4 houses on Normal Park. We lived in 3 houses. We lived at Elkins Lake in any number of houses. But we owned the Water's Edge at the 18th. We lived in 3 houses there, and 40 probably in all. Finally, we moved to Conroe, and I thought this would be it. And that's really a nice house. But now we live in Timberwild. I thought this would be it, but now Betty has decided that we need to move to Florida. I don't have a picture of that. But you can see, living with Betty is a moving experience. And I thought I might write my autobiography someday, and that would be the name of it. Debbie Portales was a student of ours, and she drew this picture once for me, and I think it's really pretty good. So one of the lessons here is listen to your wife. And I think that is important. But anyway, what I have pointed out are just a random bunch of reminiscences, things that came to mind as I was trying to think about what I would say here. But there's, in a more lasting sense, there's a poem that I'm sure many of you have read, but I think it is so important to think about. In fact, one of my recommendations to people from time to time has been to read this every morning and see what kind of impact that has on your life. But it's by Max Ehrmann, called Desiderata, and I'm going to read it in closing. Go placidly amid the noise and the haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly, and listen to others, even the dull and the ignorant. They too have their story. Avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexations to the spirit. If you compare yourself with others, you may become vain or bitter. For always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself. Enjoy your achievements as well as your plans. Keep interest in your own career, however humble. It is a real possession in the changing fortunes of time. Exercise caution in your business affairs, for the world is full of trickery. But let this not blind you to what virtue there is. Many persons strive for high ideals, and everywhere life is full of heroism. Be yourself, especially do not feign affection. Neither be cynical about love, for in the face of all aridity and disenchantment, it is as perennial as the grass. Take kindly the counsel of years, gracefully surrendering the things of youth. Now that's where I am. Nurture strength of spirit to shield you in sudden misfortune. But do not distress yourself with dark imaginings. Many fears are born of fatigue and loneliness. Beyond a wholesome discipline, be gentle with yourself. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. Therefore, be at peace with God, whatever you conceive God to be. And whatever your labors and aspirations in the noisy confusion of life, keep peace in your soul. With all of its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it's still a beautiful world. Be cheerful, strive to be happy. So, thank you.